Okay, so basically from the information that you sent me, we've got two sets of histograms telling us how beak, beak lengths in the finches changed. This is finches born 1976, this is finches born 1978. Now, obviously there was also some more information that you were given, because when I read through the answers, it starts talking about the different types of foods available. But what's happened here is basically they say the modal. Now modal rhymes with most. So whenever we're dealing with data, there's different things we can use to interpret data. Like we can use the mode, which is whatever's the most common, or the mean. The mean is the average, so you can also work out the average. Now in 1976, and this was before the drought happened, the modal length of beaks of finches being born was 8.8 millimeters. In other words, the beak was 8.8 millimeters long. That's what I mean in depth. But in 1978, can you see the modal is this one? This is the most. That's the highest column. So the modal is the column that's the highest, is 9.8 millimeters in depth. So we've got a much increased modal length of beaks here. So we had more birds being born with longer beaks in 1978 than we had been born in 1976. And in between this, there was a drought. So what they're asking you to analyze is they're trying to see if you can work out whether the drought had an effect on what we call natural selection. Now, natural selection is when some external factor affects the type of animals or birds being born. It can also affect plants and insects. So we have to have a look and see, well, did the drought that took place, did that affect the number of birds or the length of the beaks of the finches? Was there some way that affected the length so that less finches with short beaks were being born in 1978 compared to 1976? And this is where they go through and they look at all the different things. So the first thing they asked you to detect what is a question asking. Well, obviously it's asking, did natural selection affect the lengths of the beaks of the finches based on the drought that took place? What is the information provided? Well, the information provided is you have a histogram showing the lengths of beaks of finches before and after the drought. And I'm assuming also that up here somewhere there was some information given to you about what foods were available before and during the drought. All right. What is missing? What is missing is basically any other factors. Were there any predators that could have been involved with taking birds out? Anything else that could have in any way affected this other than the drought? So it's just a case of thinking of any other factors that you don't have to verify whether this was natural selection or not. The next question they ask you, steps to analyze your knowledge. Can you combine the question information and what you know to work it out? So in other words, the information they've given in the reading up before this question and in the histograms, and then also what you've been taught, what you've come to know about natural selection, what type of things affect natural selection. What is natural selection? It's basically what they're asking there. Then what do the histograms show? The histograms show a definite change in the modal amount of beak lengths. You could have also used the average, because if you were to work out the average, and they would have taken longer, but if you worked out the average, you would have seen the average beak length in 1978 is also longer than the average beak length in 1976. So you could have used the average, or as we call it in data handling, the mean, where you would have had to literally add up all of these. So like, for example, this is about 3 birds with 7.3 plus there's about 8 birds with 7.8. You have to add up all the different lengths and then divide by the total number of birds to get the average here, and the same there. And you can see that would be less accurate as well, because we can't see exactly where that bar ends. That bar ends somewhere between 0 and 10. The other thing that you can point out is that your scales are different on the two different graphs. This one goes up in 5s, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. This one goes up in 10s, 10, 20, 30, 40, which can sometimes give you what we call bias data, where a small change in this graph will be less noticeable than a small change in that graph because the scale is just bigger. However, having said that, we still have only just somewhere between 25 and 30 as the mode of 8.8 millimeter length birds here, and definitely much higher. This is somewhere between 30 and 40, so this is above 30 of beaks that are 9.8 millimeters in length. Looking then at what else they asked, they said, how can natural selection explain the change? Well, obviously natural selection then would say that birds that were better to cope with the environment of the drought, birds who are better to cope with whatever changes the drought brought about, would have a higher chance of surviving. And birds that couldn't cope with the drought conditions would then die out. So that was how natural selection would explain that change. I'm not going to spend time on the answers they've given because you can read through those yourself. Analyze your knowledge. Can you combine the question information and what you know to work it out? That's where you then say, okay, well, you've picked up that definitely more birds were born with longer beaks after the drought than before the drought, that there was an increase in the amount of finches with longer beaks. And so then taking that from the histogram to the knowledge they gave you. Now, I'm just going to have to use this information they've given here because I don't have the notes that came before this. They mention different types of plant that they can eat. So they talk about spurge plants dying during the drought. And they talk about the fact that obviously birds with a shorter beak would only eat the spurge seeds. Obviously, they didn't need as long a beak to get to the spurge seeds, the spurge seeds obviously being closer to the surface. So during the drought, birds with shorter beaks would not have been able to eat. Simple fact, like if they can't eat, you're going to die. So the birds with the shorter beaks, there would have been a high fatality rate. A lot of them would have died during the drought simply because they couldn't get to their food supply. But birds that had large beak depths and other longer beaks, they could eat caltrop seeds as well. And obviously caltrop then is something that survived the drought better. There were obviously still sufficient caltrop seeds around during the drought that birds with longer beaks could eat those, and so they survived. They didn't only survive, they reproduced. So they were thriving, they were doing okay because they had sufficient food. So because of the lack of food for the short beak birds, because of the caltrop dying, because of the spurge dying out, the birds with short beaks died. Because the birds with long beaks didn't need caltrop seeds, they could have eaten spurge seeds, they survived and reproduced. Therefore, after the drought, when we look at the numbers of finches after the drought, there's considerably more finches with long beaks and considerably less finches with short beaks. The other thing is obviously these birds all eat seed, whether it's caltrop or spurge, and then that would explain why there are so many more with long beaks, because you've also removed their competition. They don't have as much competition anymore. Before, there was limited amount of food available to the birds with long beaks because the birds with short beaks were competing for nesting space, for food. They were eating they were eating spurge seeds as well. So that kept the numbers of long-beaked birds relatively in control, whereas now the number of long-beaked birds has increased considerably because of the availability of food. This also brings out something where we're going back to what did they miss, what did they not fill in. They didn't tell us about the competition between the birds. I'm not sure, maybe it was in the notes before. Like I said, I don't have the notes, but they might have mentioned that by the short-beaked birds dying out, there's now no competition anymore for food and nesting space for the long-beaked finches. And I think that's basically that part. Then in the steps to analyze, here they're just covering basically how beak length is inherited. So in other words, birds with long beaks will give birth to birds with long beaks, and so your survivability of the long beak finches has meant that they are able to reproduce more long-beak finches, whereas obviously because the short-beak finches are dying out, they're not reproducing as much, and so there will be less short-beak offspring and more long-beak offspring after the drought. Obviously, this would definitely be a result of natural selection. This is definitely a result of the fact that food ran out for those. So basically, the way I see it is that then these answers that I've explained and that they've written here, I'm guessing that it's in red because this is the answers that were supposed to be full in, is what you should have been putting in here, because I see that that's exactly the same heading. So it's your detect, recall, solve. So you have those, your detect, recall, and solve. Where would that be? They've not put, they've just put solve, solve, solve. But at the same time, this is what are the steps in natural selection. Okay, so the steps in natural selection, maybe that's also one that I need to help you with. The steps in natural selection are simple. Basically, what happens with natural selection is when there's ever any change in the environment, any kind of physical change in an environment, it will favor one species more than another. And if that happens, if there's anything that changes an environment, then the species that is favored increases in number, and the species that is not favored decreases in number. In this case, it was a drought. That was the change. The drought favored the long-beak finches, but it was something that not only didn't favor the short-beak finches, it was actually harmful to the short-beak finches, and so they died out. Another example could be, for example, there was deforestation in certain areas. You look at areas where there's deforestation, that would definitely have a huge impact on animals that depend on the forest for their livelihood, and animals that depend on the forests would die out. So any kind of change in environment that will cause one species to die out or drastically reduce the number of things, that becomes what we call natural selection. It's as if nature is selecting a certain species over another to survive. So that's what I would have filled in here, natural selection. Hopefully you can put what I've just said into some meaningful words. So detect, we're just taking the answers that they gave in red under detect. Solve, just fill in the answers they gave and solve. I know I've been talking a lot, but I do think I covered that. And then just replay the part I said about what natural selection does, how a change in the environment will favor one species over another, and the species that is favored will survive and reproduce, whereas the species that is harmed by that change will reduce in number and maybe even become completely extinct. That's basically natural selection in a nutshell. I hope that's helped. I hope that's made your life easier. I'm going to get this video to you, and then you can just play it and listen.